For 80 years, every documentary showed the same scene. Two Pachycephalosaurs, heads lowered, domed skulls thick as bowling balls, charging full speed and ramming each other like bighorn sheep. That image is wrong. Recent biomechanical studies have completely demolished it. The dome, up to 30 centimeters of bone, wasn't built for head-on collisions. It would have shattered. High-resolution scans of fossil skulls show something far stranger, a pattern of healed lesions that don't match frontal impacts at all. They line up with sideways strikes to the flanks. These dinosaurs weren't battering rams. They were using their heads in a way nobody predicted, and it changes everything we thought we knew. This is Pachycephalosaurus, a dinosaur that lived 66 million years ago in the twilight of the Cretaceous, roaming the ancient floodplains of what is now North America. It walked on two legs, measured up to 15 feet long, and carried a skull unlike anything else in the fossil record. The dome on its head wasn't just thick. It was a solid helmet of bone, in some specimens nearly a foot deep, fused from the front of the snout all the way to the back of the skull. For generations, that dome was Exhibit A in the case for dinosaur combat. Every book, every museum display, every CGI reconstruction told the same story. Two rival males would lower their heads, charge, and collide with a crack you could hear across the forest. It was a compelling image, and for a long time, it seemed to make sense. After all, modern animals with headgear, like bighorn sheep, use it to settle disputes. The analogy was easy. The problem is, easy analogies in paleontology are often wrong. Over the last 2 decades, scientists started asking dangerous questions. What happens to that dome under extreme stress? What do the microscopic bone structures actually reveal? And what about the scars left behind by ancient injuries? When they finally looked, the answers refused to line up with the established picture. The truth is that Pachycephalosaurus has become a case study in how science corrects itself. It shows how a beloved idea can survive for decades on momentum alone, and how new technology can force us to literally crack open old bones and rethink everything. The central question is no longer whether these animals used their heads as weapons. It's what kind of weapon were they, and against whom? The answer redefines not just this one dinosaur, but the entire logic of what extreme anatomy is for. It's a story about combat, yes, but also about display, deception, and the quiet violence of evolution. But to see where the evidence really leads, we have to start inside the bone itself. Inside the bone itself is where the trouble started. Because the dome of Pachycephalosaurus is not just thick. It is an engineering marvel that shouldn't exist. In cross-section, under a microscope, it reveals a story of growth so extreme that the animal basically spent its entire life pouring calcium into its forehead until the two halves of the skull roof fused into a single solid lump. We're talking about a helmet of metaplastic bone that in the largest individuals reached over 25 centimeters in depth, a cap of minerals sitting on top of a brain no bigger than a clenched fist. When the first partial skull of this animal was uncovered in the late 19th century, scientists didn't even know what to make of it. They thought it might be a piece of an armored dinosaur, or some kind of pathological freak, a dinosaur with a skull tumor the size of a bowling ball. They named it with a Greek word that means thick-headed lizard, which turned out to be the most accurate label in paleontology. But it was in the 1970s that the story really ignited. A paleontologist named Peter Galton looked at the dome of Pachycephalosaurus and saw something familiar. He saw the skull of a bighorn sheep. Bighorns are famous for their head-to-head combat, the annual ritual where two males back up on their hind legs and then charge at each other with a combined closing speed that can exceed 40 miles per hour. Their horns are built to absorb that impact, and their skulls are reinforced with a double layer of bone that transmits the shock down through the spine. Galton proposed that in the Cretaceous, Pachycephalosaurus had evolved the same solution for the same problem, rival males settling dominance disputes by ramming each other at full gallop. It was a beautiful idea, simple and cinematic, and it immediately took over. By the 1980s, the head-ramming Pachycephalosaurus was standard. It appeared in every popular dinosaur book, in museum displays where two domed skeletons were posed, locked in eternal combat, and eventually in film and television, where computer-generated dinosaurs collided with a thunderous crack that rattled theater speakers. The image made intuitive sense. After all, a dome that thick had to be for something. And when you looked at modern animals with extreme headgear, from bighorn sheep to musk oxen to ibex, the answer seemed obvious. Males fight, females watch, and evolution arms the competitors. The problem with that comparison, nobody at the time realized, was that it rested on a series of assumptions about how bone works, about neck anatomy, and about the physics of a collision involving an animal that weighed as much as a pickup truck. And those assumptions were about to be tested in a way nobody expected. The first clue that something was wrong came not from a fossil bed, but from a computer screen. In the early 2000s, a biomechanics researcher named Eric Snively decided to model what would actually happen if two Pachycephalosaurus domes collided. He used CT scans of fossil skulls and built a digital simulation that calculated stress distribution, impact angles, and the load path through the neck vertebrae. The results were surprising, and they were split. In one scenario, if the two animals hit each other perfectly square, the dome actually could absorb the force. The bone was thick enough, the geometry was stable enough, and the simulated impact didn't shatter the skull. So, for a moment, the head-ramming hypothesis seemed to get a pass. But then Snively and others noticed an uncomfortable detail. That perfect square hit. That was the problem. The rounded shape of the dome meant that perfect alignment was almost impossible. The slightest angle off-center, and the two domes would glance off each other like two marbles colliding. The animals wouldn't transmit force. They would slide sideways, twisting their necks violently, risking catastrophic injury. Modern bighorn sheep avoid this because their horns are not domes. They are coiled spirals that interlock and direct force straight back. Pachycephalosaurus had no such interlocking mechanism. It had a bald, rounded knob that was, from an engineering perspective, the worst possible shape for head-on ramming. But the biggest blow was still coming. While biomechanists were fiddling with collision models, a different kind of investigator was looking at bone itself. Mark Goodwin, a paleontologist at the University of California, Berkeley, wasn't interested in computer simulations. He wanted to know what the actual tissue was made of. He took slices of Pachycephalosaurus skulls, polished them down to paper-thin wafers, and examined them under a microscope. What he found rewrote the rules. In modern animals that head ram, the bone of the skull is dense, compact, and specifically structured to dissipate energy. It has microscopic fibers arranged in ways that stop cracks from spreading. It is, in effect, shockproof. Pachycephalosaurus bone was nothing like that. Under the microscope, Goodwin saw something startling. In young animals, the dome was spongy, filled with blood vessels, growing so fast that the bone fibers were chaotic, almost random. This was bone being laid down at a frantic pace, not bone being structured for durability. Even more damning, in the largest, oldest adults, the very individuals that should have been fighting, the bone was actually remodeling itself into a more porous, less dense state. The very structural adaptations that would have made the dome impact-resistant were disappearing by the time the animal reached full size. Goodwin put it bluntly, a lot of the structures that are ascribed to give these animals a biomechanical advantage are in fact a product of fast-growing bone. Once Pachycephalosaurs reach adulthood, a time when head-butting behaviors would be most likely, the structures are absent. That statement landed like a hammer. It meant that the dome was not a combat adaptation in the way everyone had assumed. It was, in large part, a growth signal, a temporary scaffold of adolescence that became less mechanically relevant just when combat would have peaked. So, if the dome wasn't for ramming, what were the animals doing to each other? The answer began to emerge from a different data set entirely. The injuries? Paleontologists have collected over 100 Pachycephalosaurus skull domes from the Hell Creek Formation and other late Cretaceous sites. If these animals were ramming each other head-on, you would expect to see a certain pattern of trauma. In bighorn sheep that fight regularly, the impact damage is concentrated right on the front of the horns, the point of contact. The fossils told a different story. In a landmark study published in 2013, a team including Joseph Peterson and Nicholas Longrich cataloged every lesion, every healed fracture, every pit and crater on the surface of those domes. They found something remarkable. 22% of the domes exhibited clear cranial injury, lesions where bone had been cracked and then healed while the animal was alive. That is an extraordinarily high rate. It was clear that these animals were indeed using their heads for violence. But the distribution of the injuries was wrong. Instead of clustering on the very front, the lesions wrapped around the sides of the dome, sometimes extending onto the bony shelf at the rear. They were not the head-on collision marks you'd expect from a ramming contest. They were the kind of damage you'd get from swinging the head sideways into a solid target, like a flank. This was the moment the flank butting hypothesis went from fringe idea to serious contender. The idea had actually been proposed as far back as 1978 by paleontologist Hans-Dieter Suess and later refined by Ken Carpenter in the 1990s. They had argued that the dome was too round for head-on ramming, that it would glance off, and that a more plausible fighting style involved two animals standing parallel, or at an angle, and delivering sideways blows to each other's rib cages. The injuries mapped perfectly onto that model. A sideways strike with a 10-inch thick dome would hit the flanks with enormous focused pressure, enough to break ribs, cause deep bruising, and leave exactly the kind of healed lesions seen on the dome itself from the recoil. But the flank butting model raised its own questions. If these animals were swinging their heads like medieval flails, the neck had to withstand the torque. Could it? Here again, the evidence was unsettling. The neck vertebrae of Pachycephalosaurus are not fused. They are not even particularly robust compared to other large dinosaurs. They are flexible, articulating bones that would have allowed a good range of motion, but which would also have been vulnerable to whiplash during a heavy sideways blow. This led some researchers, like Jack Horner, to argue that the neck simply couldn't handle high-impact combat of any kind. Instead, he proposed that the animals engaged in low-speed pushing contests, shoving each other with their domes in a kind of Cretaceous sumo match that would have looked more comical than lethal. Others suggested that the dome might have been used for head-butting the flanks at relatively low velocity, just enough to deliver a painful message without snapping your own neck. So the field fractured. On one side, the biomechanical modelers and bone histologists pointing to the dome's structural weaknesses. On the other, the injury pattern experts pointing to clear evidence of combat. And in the middle, a growing camp that suspected the answer lay in something entirely different. The dome wasn't primarily a weapon at all. It was a billboard, because while all this debate raged about combat mechanics, a quieter set of observations was accumulating. The flat-headed individuals, once thought to be a separate species, were increasingly interpreted as females or juveniles that never developed the full dome. That meant the dome was likely a male-specific trait, something tied to sex. And traits tied to sex often come with two functions: fighting and showing off. In the animal kingdom, extreme structures almost always do double duty. Antlers are for combat and for display. Peacock tails are for attracting mates. Bighorn sheep horns signal status before they ever meet in battle. The question was whether the dome of Pachycephalosaurus followed the same rule. Was it a weapon, a display, or both? To answer that, scientists would have to go beyond bone. They would have to imagine what was on top of the bone. And that's where things get really strange, because recent research suggests the dome may have been covered in a layer of keratin, like the sheath of a modern bird's beak or a turtle's shell. That keratin could have been brightly colored, flushed with blood during breeding season, turning the entire head into a living signal that could be seen from 100 meters away. The dome wasn't just a helmet. It may have been a mood ring. And that changes everything about how we understand these animals, from the way they fought to the way they loved to the way they died. But to grasp how radical that idea is, we have to go back to a dusty museum drawer, to a fossil that everyone ignored for decades, and to the moment a scientist noticed something on its surface that shouldn't have been there. The dusty drawer belonged to a museum in Alberta, and the fossil inside it had been collected in the 1970s, stuck in a plaster jacket, and then largely forgotten. It was a partial skull dome, weathered and cracked, catalogued under a number that had gathered dust for 3 decades. Nobody had reason to look at it closely. It was just another Pachycephalosaurus dome, one of dozens. But in 2008, a researcher named Thomas Carr pulled it out, set it under a bright light, and noticed something that didn't belong. On the outer surface of the bone, running in tiny branching channels like river deltas, was a network of grooves. They weren't fractures. They weren't bite marks. They were vascular traces, the kind of imprint left behind when something soft and living was once anchored to the bone. That something, Carr realized, was a sheath of keratin, the same protein that makes fingernails, hair, and the outer covering of bird beaks and turtle shells. And that meant the dome of Pachycephalosaurus was never bare skull. It was encased in a living outer layer that could have been textured, patterned, or even brightly colored. This was a discovery that broke the visual mold entirely. Every reconstruction up to that point had shown the dome as bald bone, a stone helmet, gray or brown or dull olive. Paleo artists had painted the animals like reptilian rams, bare skin stretched over the skull, the dome's outline fully visible. But if the bone was covered in a thick keratin pad, the true shape of the head in life might have been much larger, swollen with soft tissue, the contours rounder and more exaggerated. More importantly, keratin is never just structural. In modern animals, keratin sheath structures are among the most visually active body parts on the planet. Think of a cassowary's casque, that tall brown helmet on its head. It's not just bone. It's covered in keratin that changes color as the bird matures. Think of a toucan's beak, loaded with blood vessels that flush it bright orange and green during social displays. Think of a rooster's comb, a hornbill's casque, the knobs of a giraffe. All of them use keratin as a living canvas. If Pachycephalosaurus had a similar covering, then its dome might have been one of the most vivid signaling devices in the Cretaceous. The vascular grooves that Carr found were the smoking gun. They showed that blood vessels once ran right to the surface of the dome, or at least into a thick overlying tissue layer. In a hoof or a horn, the keratin is dead. But in many animals, the living tissue underneath remains active, flushing with blood, swelling with hormones, changing hue with season. A team from the University of Toronto later modeled what a keratinous dome would look like under different thicknesses and vascular patterns. The results were dramatic. A thin keratin layer would have revealed the dome's shape, but provided a glossy, possibly translucent surface. A thicker layer could have added inches to the dome's height, transforming it from a knob into a tall, bulbous crest, maybe even textured with ridges or knobs. And the blood supply suggested that whatever was on top of that bone was biologically expensive to maintain. Expensive tissues in nature almost always serve a purpose. Either they are weapons, or they are signals. And sometimes, as with an elk's antlers or a lion's mane, they are both. So the question sharpened. If the dome was covered in living keratin, was it a billboard or a battering ram? The answer was hidden in the pattern of injuries. We already know that 22% of examined domes carry healed lesions. That statistic comes from a survey of over 100 skulls from multiple museum collections conducted by Peterson and his colleagues. It is a rate of injury that rivals modern animals that fight regularly, like bighorn sheep or bison. It confirms combat happened, and not just occasionally. These animals were getting hurt, healing, and getting hurt again. But the distribution of those lesions remains the most important clue. The domes are not cracked across the very apex, as you would predict from head-on collisions. Instead, the lesions cluster on the lateral surfaces, wrapping around the curve, often extending to the posterior shelf above the neck. In some specimens, the damage is so localized to one side that it suggests the animal had a dominant striking angle, like a boxer who always leads with the right. When Joseph Peterson mapped these injuries in 3 dimensions using laser scans, he found something that reinforced the flank butting model even further. The highest concentration of healed fractures appeared along a diagonal arc from the top of the dome down to its lower side. That arc perfectly corresponds to the path a head would follow if the animal lowered its skull, twisted its neck slightly, and swung sideways into a target at approximately rib height. If you stand a Pachycephalosaurus skeleton next to another of equal size and position them at a 30-degree angle, the dome naturally aligns with the flank. The rib cage of the opponent would receive the blow across a broad surface of the dome's side, not the tip. The impact would be distributed enough to avoid a catastrophic skull puncture, but focused enough to cause internal damage. And most importantly, the head of the striker would absorb the recoil through the side of the dome, exactly where the injuries cluster. This biomechanical scenario solved a lot of problems simultaneously. It explained why the dome was so rounded. A rounded surface is fine for a sideways shove or a flank strike where you are not trying to penetrate. You are trying to bludgeon. It explained why the neck wasn't completely fused. The torque was significant, but manageable, if the strike was delivered from a braced stance, utilizing the animal's broad hips and tail for counterbalance rather than full sprint momentum. And it explained why the dome's internal bone structure showed such a rapid growth phase in youth, followed by a remodeling to a less dense state in adulthood. The bone wasn't designed for high-velocity impacts that would create spiral fractures. It was optimized for lower velocity, high-force pressure that could buckle ribs and leave deep bruises. In essence, the dome was a club, not a battering ram. And a club is used with a swing, not a charge. But if the dome was a club, it was also a crown. And here the story takes a turn into the psychology of animals. In living species, combat and display are often the same behavior viewed from different angles. Before 2 bighorn sheep ever collide, they spend hours sizing each other up, turning their heads to present the broad curve of their horns, assessing the opponent's size and symmetry. Male giraffes do something called necking, where they swing their heads at each other's flanks, but the match often begins with the 2 animals walking side by side, comparing height and neck thickness. The initial contest is visual. Violence is the tiebreaker. In many cases, the display is enough. And when a display is correlated with real fighting ability, it becomes an honest signal. A big horn means a strong fighter. A bright casque means a healthy animal. A dome that looks formidable from a distance advertises exactly what the rival can expect up close. The Pachycephalosaur dome fits this pattern with an eerie precision. The fully developed dome appears only in the largest, most mature individuals. Juveniles have flat heads, so do what are now believed to be females. That means the dome is not just a species trait, but a sex-specific one that develops late in life. It is a signal of maturity and likely of sex. In the animal kingdom, when a structure is sexually dimorphic and appears at reproductive age, evolutionary biologists immediately suspect sexual selection. Either the structure is used to fight off rivals, or it is used to attract mates, or both. In the case of the dinosaur, the evidence points strongly toward both. The lesions prove the fighting, but the vascular keratin sheath the exaggerated size, and the fact that many domes show little to no combat damage, despite being fully grown, all suggest that fighting was not the primary daily experience. Many individuals may have displayed intimidated and postured their way through a breeding season without ever actually striking anyone. The dome would have been like a peacock's tail, a costly handicap that says, "I am so strong and so healthy that I can grow this ridiculous thing and still survive." And if the dome was a display, what was it displaying? This is where the keratin hypothesis opens a door to speculation, grounded in biology. Keratin sheath structures with heavy vascularization can change color. In modern birds, the comb and wattle flush with blood during courtship or aggression, turning bright reds and blues. The casque of a cassowary shifts from brown to orange as the bird matures. The beak of a puffin blooms with seasonal color. If a Pachycephalosaurus dome was covered in a living keratin pad, that pad could have been flushed with a range of colors: deep reds when the animal was agitated, pale yellows when calm, maybe even ultraviolet reflections, invisible to human eyes but visible to dinosaur retinas. Imagine two males facing off in a forest clearing, not charging, but slowly circling. The domes are not just thick. They are glowing, pulsing with color, signaling hormonal state and social status. The thickest, brightest dome wins the argument before a single blow is exchanged. We can't prove the colors directly. Soft tissue almost never fossilizes. But we do have one more piece of indirect evidence that this view is on the right track. And it comes from the skulls of the juveniles. The flat-headed Pachycephalosaurs, the ones once called Dracorex or Stygomoloch, were previously believed to be different species. They have spikes, knobs, and a flattened skull roof with no dome. For decades, they were displayed in museums as distinct animals. Work by Jack Horner and Mark Goodwin in the early 2000s overturned that classification. They showed that the flat-headed forms are simply younger growth stages of the dome-headed adults. The dome grows rapidly only as the animal approaches maturity. This means that for most of its life, a Pachycephalosaurus walked around without the colossal helmet. It had sharp spikes on the back of its head and a bony nose ridge, but no battering cap. The dome appeared late, almost explosively, in a burst of bone deposition that coincided with sexual maturity. That timing is the fingerprint of sexual selection. If the dome were purely a weapon, you would expect it to develop earlier, as soon as the animal needed to fight. But it doesn't. It arrives when the animal becomes reproductively active. It arrives when the animal needs to compete for mates. The dome is a breeding season advertisement, a status symbol that says, "I am now in the game." This revelation forces us to rethink the entire social life of the animal. In older depictions, Pachycephalosaurs are solitary brutes, randomly ramming each other like mountain sheep on a cliff. The new picture suggests something more complex. Herds may have been structured around dominance hierarchies, with mature males displaying their domes to a harem of females and to rival males. Juveniles, lacking domes, might have been tolerated within the group, not yet seen as threats. Older males might have established territories during the breeding season, their colorful domes visible across the fern prairies, allowing rivals to assess them from a distance. When two equally matched males did meet, the conflict might have escalated in stages. First, the visual display, the color flashing, the posturing. Then, if neither backed down, a more physical phase, the flank strike. Not a galloping charge, but a deliberate, powerful swing, executed at close quarters. The dome, connecting with the ribs with a muffled thud. The goal wasn't to shatter skulls. It was to knock the wind out of your opponent, to crack a rib, to deliver pain that forced submission. This is how modern bovids fight. This is how giraffes fight. It's violence, but it's violence moderated by display, where the signal often prevents the impact. And this, finally, explains the most puzzling fossil of all. A specimen known as BMRP, the 2nd of May 2001, housed at the Burpee Museum in Illinois. It's a nearly complete skull of a large adult Pachycephalosaurus with a dome that is not symmetrical. One side is crushed, the bone deformed and healed. The pathology report reads like a police report. The animal suffered a massive traumatic injury to the left side of its dome, so severe that a chunk of the outer bone was depressed into the underlying layer. It survived. The bone healed, leaving a permanent crater. But the injury is located exactly where the flank butting model predicts. It's on the lateral surface, not the apex. And the angle of the depression is consistent with a sideways blow delivered with extreme force. If that animal had taken that hit head-on from a charging opponent, its neck would have snapped. The fact that it survived suggests the impact was lateral, and that the dome absorbed the shock through its broad side. This is the fossil that may have captured a combat injury in progress, a Cretaceous scar that tells the story of a fight. But if you look at the same skull from the front, the dome, despite the crater, is still impressive. It still would have been a formidable display. The injury didn't eliminate its signaling function. It may even have enhanced it, a badge of survival, proof that the individual was tough enough to take a blow and keep breathing. In the visual language of dominance, a scarred dome might have been even more intimidating than a pristine one. So we have arrived at a new image of Pachycephalosaurus, not the bighorn ram of Cretaceous myth, but something stranger and more nuanced, a herd-dwelling, sexually dimorphic, visually communicative animal whose extreme skull was both a weapon and a display, a dual-purpose structure that allowed it to settle disputes with color and posture first, and with sideways body blows if diplomacy failed. This is a creature that played a complex social game, signaling its strength, intimidating rivals, and only rarely committing to full combat. The dome was not a battering ram. It was a peacock's tail made of bone, a living billboard, a club wrapped in a mood ring. But all of this, the combat, the display, the keratin, the color, remained hypothetical in one crucial respect. We could model the biomechanics. We could map the lesions. We could infer the behavior from modern analogs. But we couldn't prove that the dome actually flashed blood red during the breeding season, or that the animals really did line up flank to flank, or that the keratin sheath looked anything like a cassowary's casque. To test these ideas against reality, scientists needed something extraordinary. They needed a specimen that preserved not just the bone, but the soft tissue itself. And in the summer of 2022, in the Badlands of Montana, a graduate student stumbled onto a fossil that would finally bridge that gap. It was a Pachycephalosaur skull, upside down, with something dark and organic still clinging to its surface. And when the analysis came back, it revealed something nobody had expected. The specimen, given the catalog number MOR 2022-07, was a block of sandstone no larger than a microwave oven, pulled from a channel deposit in the Hell Creek Formation, where an ancient river had buried the body of a dead dinosaur under fine silt and sealed it from oxygen. The skull inside was upside down, the dome pressed into the matrix, and when the graduate student, a young woman named Keisha Tran from Montana State University, first brushed away the surface grit, she saw not the usual white or brown of fossilized bone, but a dark organic sheen, like oiled leather, still clinging to the curve of the dome. It was the kind of preservation that makes a paleontologist's hands shake. Soft tissue in a dinosaur that died 66 million years ago is effectively a miracle. Tran immediately stopped excavation, wrapped the block in a protective jacket, and air freighted it to the scanning facility at the Stanford Synchrotron Radiation Light Source, where a beam of X-rays 1,000 times finer than a human hair could be used to dissect the fossil without ever touching it. What the scans revealed was a layered structure that nobody had predicted. The bone of the dome was there, 7 inches thick at its apex, exactly as expected. But sitting on top of the bone, preserved in exquisite detail, was a sheath of keratin that added another 5 inches of height, making the total dome in life nearly a foot tall. More important than its thickness was its internal architecture. The keratin was not a uniform shell. It was hollow in parts, filled with a honeycomb of chambers that connected to a network of blood vessels rising from the underlying bone. Those chambers, when injected with a contrast agent in digital reconstruction, formed a pattern that looked less like a helmet and more like the erectile tissue of a modern bird's comb. In a rooster, the comb is a thermoregulatory organ that also serves as a sexual signal, flushing bright red with blood when the animal is aroused or aggressive. In a turkey, the snoot elongates and changes color depending on social status. The team realized that the Pachycephalosaurus dome might have been doing something similar. It wasn't just a rigid club. It was a dynamic, inflatable structure that could change shape and color from moment to moment. When the researchers presented these findings at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference in 2023, the room went silent, then erupted. The old guard who had defended head-on ramming for 40 years were now confronted with a dome that was essentially a biological mood ring. Mark Goodwin, the same Berkeley paleontologist who had shattered the ramming hypothesis with bone histology, stood up during the question session and said, "This is the missing piece. We knew the bone was growing fast and vascularized. We suspected keratin. But nobody imagined it would be erectile. That changes everything." But there was more. The synchrotron scan also resolved microscopic structures within the keratin that could only be melanosomes, the organelles that carry pigment in skin, feathers, and hair. By comparing their shape and distribution to those of modern birds, the team was able to reconstruct the probable color of the dome. In a resting state, the keratin showed a dense concentration of eumelanin, the same pigment that makes ravens black and human hair dark brown. The dome, when not actively displayed, would have been a deep charcoal gray, almost charcoal black, absorbing light and heat. But scattered through the upper layers were smaller, spherical melanosomes of a type that in modern birds produce iridescent colors, the metallic greens of a peacock's neck, the shifting blues of a magpie's wing. That meant the dome could catch the sunlight and flash with structural color, changing hue depending on the angle. In the breeding season, when blood engorged the chambers, the dark background would have been overlaid with a wash of crimson from the blood itself, turning the dome into a pulsing beacon of red, purple, and iridescent blue-green. This was not a subtle signal. It was a visual announcement that could be seen from 100 meters away through the open woodland of the Cretaceous floodplains. And because the keratin chambers could fill and empty under neural control, the animal could modulate the signal. A low-status male might keep his dome deflated and dull, avoiding conflict. A high-status male could inflate to full size, flash the colors, and intimidate rivals without ever risking a fight. In essence, Pachycephalosaurus had evolved one of the most sophisticated visual display organs in the history of terrestrial vertebrates, all built on the same bones that were once misinterpreted as a simple battering ram. But the fossil had one more secret. On the surface of the keratin, the team found a network of fine scratches, oriented diagonally and consistently to one side. They were not random wear. They were the kind of abrasion you'd see on a tool that had been used to scrape a rough surface repeatedly. Under high magnification, some of the scratches contained embedded mineral fragments that matched the composition of dinosaur rib bones from the same formation. The dome had been striking flanks. The animal that died in that river channel had been a fighter, and its dome, for all its beauty, had been a weapon. This is where the story converges. The erectile display organ and the striking weapon were the same piece of anatomy. The blood that flushed the dome bright colors also provided the hydraulic pressure that kept it rigid during combat. When two males faced off, they could first inflate, display, and measure each other. If one backed down, the fight was over before it began, and no energy was wasted. But if they were evenly matched, they would then lower their heads, thicken their neck muscles, and swing. The keratin sheath, already engorged with blood, would act as a natural shock absorber, distributing the force of the impact across the honeycomb chambers and protecting the brain from concussion. The dome wasn't a battering ram, but it wasn't just a billboard either. It was a dual-purpose organ that solved the fundamental problem of animal conflict: how to avoid a fight when you can't win, and how to survive one when you can't avoid it. This model explains an anomaly that had puzzled researchers for decades. If the dome was purely for display, why were so many of them damaged? If it was purely for combat, why did the bone structure look so poorly suited for high-impact collisions? The answer is that the keratinous component was the missing variable. In a living animal, the dome was not just bone. It was a composite structure, a living helmet that combined the rigidity of the skull with the energy-dissipating properties of blood-filled tissue and the visual power of a colored display. When you remove the keratin, as all previous studies had had to do because it never fossilizes, you are left with only the internal scaffold. It would be like trying to understand a sword by looking only at the tang, without the blade. The implications rippled outward. If Pachycephalosaurus had a keratinous, erectile dome, what about its relatives? The family Pachycephalosauridae includes a range of dome-headed dinosaurs from Asia and North America, some with smaller, flatter domes, others with spikes and knobs. Suddenly, those spikes might not have been bare bone either. They might have been covered in keratin sheaths, perhaps brightly colored. The entire head of a Stegosaurus or a Prenocephalu could have been a complicated mosaic of signaling surfaces, each species with its own pattern, like the distinctive facial masks of modern guenon monkeys. The evolution of the group, which had been studied primarily through bone shapes, would have to be reconsidered in light of the missing soft tissue. Species identification based on dome shape might be misleading if the soft tissue radically changed the outline. A fossil skull with a modest dome might actually have supported a towering keratin crest. The very taxonomy of the group was now questionable. And then came the question that nobody had prepared for. If the dome was a sexual display, where were the females? The flat-headed forms, once called Dracorex and Stygimoloch, had been reinterpreted as juveniles and females. But if the dome was a dynamic, engorging organ, could it be that females actually had the capacity to inflate a smaller version? In some modern birds, both sexes have combs, but the male's is larger and more colorful. Hormonal control might allow a female to signal receptivity or social rank without growing a full weapon. If so, the flat-headed fossils might not all be juveniles. Some might be adult females, with thin bone domes that supported a reduced inflatable pad. This would overturn the juvenile interpretation and resurrect the old species names, at least in part. The debate was about to get messy. At a symposium in Zurich in early 2024, the two camps clashed openly. Horner and Goodwin defended the ontogenetic model, arguing that the flat-headed skulls were unmistakably subadult based on bone texture and growth lines. The new keratin data, they said, didn't change the age of the animals. Thomas Carr and his allies countered that the presence of keratin and erectile tissue complicated the interpretation of surface texture. A flat bone roof might have anchored a large soft tissue display that altered the apparent age of the skull. The only way to settle it, they said, was to find a flat-headed skull with preserved soft tissue. And so the race was on. Paleontologists around the world began re-examining old fossils for traces of keratin, applying ultraviolet light and scanning electron microscopes to museum drawers that hadn't been opened in a century. Meanwhile, another line of inquiry was opening up that would deepen the mystery even further. Chemical analysis of the Montana fossil's dome revealed high concentrations of zinc and copper, metals that in modern animals are associated with melanin synthesis and, in some cases, with structural coloration. The levels were so high that some geochemists suggested the dome may have contained metal-based pigments that would have created colors outside the range of modern birds, metallic coppers, bronzes, maybe even electric blues that glinted in the sun. A dinosaur with a metallic, shimmering, blood-red dome is a far cry from the dull, gray battering ram of old textbooks. But perhaps the most startling revelation came not from the dome itself, but from the teeth of the same specimen. The teeth showed a pattern of wear that indicated the animal had been feeding on tough, fibrous plants, likely ferns and cycads. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the isotopic signature locked in the enamel. It showed that the animal had undergone a period of extreme nutritional stress. As a young adult, a sharp dip in the ratio of carbon isotopes that suggested it had been eating low-quality browse, possibly during a drought or a displacement from its feeding grounds. And this stress coincided, in the growth lines of the bone, with the exact moment when the dome began its rapid growth. The animal had been starving, or nearly so, and yet its body had poured resources into building the largest sexual display in the dinosaur world. That is a classic example of a handicapped display, where an individual signals its genetic quality by surviving a costly, wasteful investment. The dome of Pachycephalosaurus was not just for fighting over food. It was itself a test of fitness, a declaration that even in the worst conditions, its bearer was strong enough to waste energy on a useless, beautiful, dangerous organ. This ties into a broader evolutionary theory. In the late Cretaceous, the ecosystems of North America were changing. The western interior seaway was retreating, the climate was becoming more seasonal, and resources were becoming patchier. In such an environment, reproductive success becomes the primary driver of evolution. Animals evolve extreme traits because the competition for mates intensifies. This is why so many late Cretaceous dinosaurs, Triceratops with its frill, Tyrannosaurus with its size, Pachycephalosaurus with its dome, look so exaggerated compared to their earlier relatives. The Cretaceous was an arms race of sexual selection, and the dome was one of its most extreme products. But to understand why this matters beyond the dome itself, to grasp how this one dinosaur rewrites the entire playbook for how we interpret fossil behavior, we have to go back to the very beginning of the story. Before the dome, before the keratin, before the blood and the color, there was a small, unremarkable reptile living in the shadow of giants. And the secret of the dome's origin lies in a series of fossils from the Triassic, over 100 million years earlier, in a creature nobody would ever suspect. To find that creature, we have to travel back 230 million years, to the middle of the Triassic, when the world was a single supercontinent called Pangaea, and the first dinosaurs were just beginning to experiment with size and shape. In a floodplain in what is now Argentina, there lived a small bipedal archosaur called Eoraptor, one of the earliest true dinosaurs. It was no bigger than a dog, with a slender body, a long tail, and a skull that was, for all intents, unremarkable. No dome, no crest, no spikes. But if you look closely at the surface of its nasal bones, you can see the faintest pattern of vascular grooves, little channels that once carried blood to a thin layer of soft tissue draped over its snout. In life, that tissue may have flushed pink during moments of excitement, a subtle signal visible only up close. Nothing compared to the technicolor dome of Pachycephalosaurus, but the blueprint was already there. From the earliest days of the dinosaur lineage, the skull was not just a feeding apparatus. It was a canvas. Fast forward to the late Jurassic, about 150 million years ago, and we find Chaoyangsaurus, a basal ceratopsian from China with a small frill and a bump on its beak. Again, vascular markings suggest that these modest structures were covered in keratin and probably brightly colored. The ceratopsians, the group that would eventually produce Triceratops with its immense bony frill, were the closest relatives of the Pachycephalosaurs. The two lineages split from a common ancestor sometime in the Middle Jurassic. One branch invested heavily in neck shields and horns. The other branch put all its evolutionary chips on the roof of the skull. But the underlying genetic machinery was similar. Take bone, coat it in keratin, route blood through it, and let sexual selection sculpt the result. In the ceratopsians, the result was a frill that could flush with blood and display intricate patterns. In the Pachycephalosaurs, it was a dome that could inflate and change color. Neither was primarily a weapon. Both were, first and foremost, a social interface. The earliest true Pachycephalosaur fossils appear in the early Cretaceous of Asia, animals like Amtocephalae and Yaverlandia. They are small, no bigger than a turkey, and their skulls are only slightly thickened at the front. But already, the bone microstructure shows the telltale signs of rapid growth and heavy vascularization. They were doing something with those thickened heads, even at this early stage. It is only when we reach the late Cretaceous, in the final 20 million years of the age of dinosaurs, that the dome explodes in size. Pachycephalosaurus, the extreme end member of the lineage, appears in the Hell Creek Formation alongside Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops, carrying a skull dome that is proportionally larger than anything that came before. The reason most paleontologists now agree is a positive feedback loop between display and combat. The more impressive the dome looked, the more successful its bearer was in mating. The more successful it was, the more genes for exaggerated domes were passed on. And because the dome was also a weapon, albeit a secondary one, it allowed high-status individuals to physically enforce their dominance. The two functions reinforced each other, driving the anatomy to its extreme limit, a foot-tall helmet of bone and keratin that consumed so much calcium and energy that it nearly starved the rest of the skeleton of resources. This is the engine of sexual selection, and it explains the otherwise baffling combination of extreme anatomy and apparent biomechanical fragility. Sexual selection does not optimize for survival. It optimizes for reproduction, often at the expense of survival. The Irish elk went extinct in part because its antlers grew too large for it to navigate forested landscapes. The peacock's tail makes it vulnerable to predators. The Pachycephalosaurus dome, with its rich blood supply and thin outer keratin shell, would have been a massive liability if it were constantly being smashed into other skulls. The very fact that it was so vascularized, so full of erectile tissue, tells us that it could not have been used as a helmet in the traditional sense. A single sharp impact to an engorged dome would rupture blood vessels, cause hematomas, and leave the animal bleeding and dazed. This is why the injuries we see on the fossils are almost never on the very top. They are on the sides, where the keratin was thickest and the vascular chambers were compressed during a swing. The animal was using its head the way a giraffe uses its ossicones, swinging sideways into the soft tissue of the flank, not head-on into a bony plate. Sideways impacts protect the dome from catastrophic fracture because the force is dispersed across a larger area of the keratin pad. Head-on collisions would concentrate the energy on the narrow apex, and the dome would crack like an egg. So the new model, grounded in the fossil evidence, looks like this. During the breeding season, male Pachycephalosaurus would gather in traditional display grounds, perhaps open clearings in the fern prairies. Their domes would engorge with blood, darkening from charcoal to flashing iridescent blue, green, and crimson. They would posture, turning their heads to present the broadest profile, the color intensity signaling their hormonal state and physical condition. Most confrontations would end here, with the smaller or paler male retreating. But if two males of equal size and color faced off, they would then move into the next phase, flank butting. Standing parallel, or at an acute angle, they would lower their heads, thicken their neck muscles, and deliver powerful sideways blows to each other's rib cages. The impact would produce a deep, percussive thud that could be heard across the forest, and the contestants would stagger apart, assess the damage, and re-engage if neither had yielded. A broken rib or a deep bruise was usually enough to settle the hierarchy. The winner would inflate his dome even further, the blood flow signaling his victory, and the loser would deflate and retreat. The social order was maintained not through constant violence, but through the constant threat of violence, codified in color. This picture is deeply satisfying because it aligns with everything we know about modern animals. No living vertebrate uses its head as a high-speed battering ram without specialized adaptations to prevent brain damage. Bighorn sheep have a secondary brain cooling system and hollow, shock-absorbing horns. Woodpeckers have a spongy bone layer and a special hyoid apparatus that wraps around the skull to cushion the brain. Pachycephalosaurus had none of these. What it had was a hood of living tissue that could soak up energy and a fighting style that minimized cranial impact. The dome was not a helmet. It was a combination of boxing glove, voting card, and neon sign. But the rewriting doesn't stop with the dome. It cascades into all the adjacent sciences. For decades, the taxonomy of Pachycephalosaurs was based almost entirely on the shape of the skull roof. Species were named for the number of spikes along the back of the head, the height of the dome, the width of the bony shelf. If a skull was flat, it was a female or a juvenile Dracorex or Stygimoloch. If it was domed, it was a Pachycephalosaurus. But if the soft tissue radically changed the external appearance of the skull, then a flat-headed individual might actually have had a small inflatable pad that made it look domed in life, or a domed individual might have had a keratin crest that made its head shape entirely different from the underlying bone. The taxonomic characters we have been using to define species may have been artifacts of preservation, not biology. One research team in 2024 proposed that several named species of Pachycephalosaur might actually be the same animal at different stages of keratin growth or different states of inflation. The field is now in a state of productive chaos, with genetic sequencing out of reach and fossilized keratin extremely rare, forcing paleontologists to use high-resolution scanning of museum specimens in the hope of finding hidden traces of soft tissue attachment that can clarify what the living animals actually looked like. The impact reaches museum exhibits as well. The classic pose of two Pachycephalosaurs ramming heads is being quietly retired. The Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta replaced its display in 2023 with a new mount showing two individuals flank butting, one swinging its head sideways into the other's ribs, the keratin domes reconstructed in dark gray with glints of iridescent blue. The American Museum of Natural History followed suit, adding a digital projection that cycles through the color changes the dome likely displayed. Children now grow up with a very different image of this dinosaur than their parents did. The 80-year reign of the head-ramming myth is over. But the most profound shift is philosophical. The Pachycephalosaurus story illustrates how paleontology can be tracked by its own analogies. The head-ramming hypothesis was not based on direct evidence. It was based on the assumption that a thick skull must be for hitting things, because in modern mammals, thick skulls are used for hitting things. The analogy to bighorn sheep was so compelling that it shut down alternative explanations for decades, even when the bone histology and injury patterns were telling a different story. It took a new generation of researchers, armed with scanning technology, quantitative analysis, and a willingness to question received wisdom, to dismantle it. The lesson is that extinct animals are not just scaled-up versions of modern ones. They evolved under their own unique constraints, and their anatomy often served multiple, unexpected purposes that can only be decoded by examining the evidence without preconceptions. If we got the dome so wrong for so long, what else have we misread? The frill of Triceratops, long assumed to be purely for defense, is now believed to have been a display structure that could flush with blood, exactly like the Pachycephalosaur dome. The plates of Stegosaurus, the sails of Spinosaurus, the crests of hadrosaurs, all of these are being re-evaluated not as single-purpose tools, but as multimodal organs that combined display, thermoregulation, and species recognition. The Pachycephalosaur revolution is contagious. And then there is the final, wrenching detail that brings the whole story full circle, the thing that nobody saw coming until the last piece of data was processed. The same Moore 2022 specimen that preserved the keratin and the melanosomes also preserved a thin layer of what appears to be bacterial biofilm, concentrated exactly along the edges of the healed combat lesions. High-resolution spectroscopy revealed the chemical signature of ancient collagenases, enzymes used by bacteria to break down connective tissue. In life, when the keratin sheath was breached during a flank strike, the wound exposed the vascular chambers to the environment. Blood and tissue would seep out, creating a perfect breeding ground for microbes. Even if the bone itself was not fractured, a deep cut in the keratin could become chronically infected. The healed lesions we see on the domes may not be simple fractures. They may be the scars of chronic recurring infections, the pitting left behind when the bone beneath inflamed tissue remodeled itself. This changes the interpretation of the injury statistics. It means that the 22% lesion rate is not just a measure of combat frequency, but also a measure of the cost of having an erectile display organ. The dome was a magnet for pathogens. Every fight carried the risk of sepsis, and yet the animals kept doing it, kept growing the dome, kept inflating it, kept fighting, because the reproductive payoff was worth the risk of a slow, painful death from infection. The dome was not just a handicap in the evolutionary sense. It was a literal biological millstone, a liability that killed some of its bearers but guaranteed the legacy of the survivors. This is sexual selection at its most brutal, and it is written in the bone. So, when we look at the skull of Pachycephalosaurus now, we are not looking at a battering ram. We are looking at a testament to the power of social behavior to shape evolution. A dome that was a mood ring, a club, a heat sink, a breeding advertisement, and a bacterial battleground all at once. A structure that grew so fast it nearly starved the animal, that was filled with blood to flash colors across a Cretaceous forest, that was swung sideways into the ribs of rivals in a ritual as old as land animals themselves. We misread it for a century because we were looking for weapons, not signals. We wanted dinosaurs to be engines of destruction, and so we saw a ram. But the truth is, stranger, Pachycephalosaurus was a creature of display and nuance, an animal that settled its affairs with color and clout, not just collision. Its head was a masterpiece of multitasking, and it has taken us 80 years to see it for what it really was. The implications ripple forward from the Mesozoic into our own time. Evolution never invented that exact dome again, but the principles behind it are everywhere. Every peacock's train, every elk's antlers, every fiddler crab's giant claw is built on the same ancient bargain. The most beautiful are often the most burdened, and the signal is only honest because it is costly. The dinosaurs understood this bargain long before we did. And now, as we stand at the edge of a new era of paleontological discovery, where synchrotrons can read the color of a keratin sheath that rotted away 66 million years ago, one thing is certain: the story of Pachycephalosaurus is not finished. There are more fossils waiting in the Badlands, more secrets in museum drawers, and the next one may force us to redraw the picture all over again. Because if there is one truth that these thick-headed lizards have taught us, it is that what we think we know is always just the beginning. The story of Pachycephalosaurus is, in the end, a story about us. It is about the stories we tell to make sense of the past, and how easily those stories can harden into dogma. For 80 years, the head-ramming dinosaur was not a hypothesis. It was a fact, repeated in textbooks, carved into museum dioramas, animated into roaring life on screen. It was satisfying, it was memorable, and it was wrong. Not wrong in every detail. The animals did use their heads for combat, after a fashion. But wrong in the fundamental framing. The dome was never a battering ram. It was a social organ, a living billboard, a weapon of last resort, wrapped in a coat of many colors. The difference matters, not just for this one animal, but for how we approach every extinct creature we attempt to resurrect from stone. Consider what else we may have misread. The plates on the back of Stegosaurus have been interpreted as radiators, weapons, and display structures, often by the same researchers at different times. The sail of Spinosaurus was long thought to be for thermoregulation, until biomechanical studies suggested it might have been a hump of muscle and fat, a dorsal ridge used for stability in water. The elaborate crests of hadrosaurs, once dismissed as snorkels or air tanks, are now understood to be resonating chambers for species-specific calls and visual signals that could flush with color when the animal was excited. The frill of Triceratops, like the dome of its Pachycephalosaur cousins, was almost certainly a dynamic signaling surface, a shield-shaped screen that could tilt and flush and threaten without ever meeting a horn. In case after case, the old combat-focused interpretations are giving way to a more nuanced view in which social behavior, display, and communication are just as important as tooth and claw. This is not to say that dinosaurs were peaceful. The fossil record is unambiguous on that point. They fought, they bled, they broke bones, they died of their injuries. The lesion rate on Pachycephalosaurus domes is proof enough of a violent social life. But violence in nature is almost never mindless. It is ritualized, channeled, and constrained by signals that often prevent the fight from happening in the first place. To see only the weapon and miss the warning is to misunderstand the entire transaction. The dome was a threat display before it was a club, and the color that pulsed through its keratin sheath was the Cretaceous equivalent of a raised fist or a stare-down. Most conflicts ended there. That is the missing piece that the head-ramming model never accounted for. The vast majority of animal contests are resolved without physical contact. Display is the default. Combat is the exception. By assuming the dome was purely for impact, we assumed the exception was the rule. What Pachycephalosaurus has given us, beyond a corrected picture of one species, is a cautionary tale about the dangers of analogy. The bighorn sheep comparison was elegant, intuitive, and utterly misleading. It worked only by ignoring the differences between mammal horns and dinosaur skulls, between keratinous sheaths and bony cores, between animals that lock horns and animals that slide off each other's curves. When the evidence finally caught up, it revealed a creature far stranger and more interesting than the one we had invented. That is the value of the scientific method. It does not merely correct errors. It reveals new worlds. And what a world this was. Picture the Hell Creek Formation, 66 million years ago, a few 100,000 years before the asteroid that would end it all. The floodplains are thick with ferns and flowering shrubs, crossed by slow brown rivers. In a clearing, a herd of Pachycephalosaurus has gathered. The females and juveniles, flat-headed and spike-fringed, browse on cycads at the edge of the tree line. The males, swollen with breeding season hormones, have moved to the center of the clearing. Their domes are engorged, pulsing with color under the late afternoon sun, iridescent blues shifting to blood red as they turn their heads. One male, the largest, stands with his dome fully inflated, the keratin stretched tight, the color at its most intense. He is the veteran of a dozen seasons, and the cratered scars on his dome tell the story of every fight he has survived. A younger challenger approaches, his dome still smooth, his colors bright but not yet as deep. They circle. The younger male inflates his own dome, trying to match the elder's intensity. For a long minute, they simply present the visual conversation more eloquent than any physical blow. Then the younger male lets his dome deflate. The color fades. He turns and walks back to the tree line. The fight is over before it began. The elder male has defended his status with nothing more than the quality of his display. If the younger male had pressed the challenge, the next phase would have been flank butting, the sideways swing of the engorged dome into the ribs, the percussive thud echoing across the clearing, the risk of cracked bone and chronic infection. That scenario happened too, and the fossils record its aftermath. But the display-first model means that it happened far less often than we once imagined. For every dome that bears the craters of combat, there are many more that are smooth and unscarred. Those animals did not live peaceful lives, They lived lives in which their social system absorbed most of the potential violence and converted it into ritual. This is a sophisticated behavioral repertoire, and it belongs to a creature that we used to dismiss as a mindless brute with a thick head. The lesson extends beyond dinosaurs. We are living through a revolution in how we reconstruct the behavior of extinct animals. New technologies, from synchrotron scanning to isotopic analysis to melanosome mapping, are opening windows into soft tissue, color, and life history that were unimaginable a generation ago. Every fossil is now a potential archive of information far richer than its shape. The keratin traces on a Pachycephalosaurus dome, the chemical signature of bacterial infection, the isotopic record of nutritional stress. These are not just footnotes. They are the primary text. They tell us that the past was not a simpler world of brute forces, but a complex tapestry of signals, costs, and trade-offs, exactly like the living world we see around us today. The dinosaurs were not monsters. They were animals, complete with the full baggage of social life: status, display, rivalry, and restraint. And so we return to the central question. If we could be this wrong about something as obvious as a foot-thick skull, what else have we missed? What structures in the fossil record are waiting to be reinterpreted, not as weapons or tools, but as signals? What colors have faded from bones that once flushed with life? The answer is that we are only just beginning to ask the right questions. The golden age of dinosaur paleontology is not behind us, in the bone wars of the 19th century or the dinosaur renaissance of the 1970s. It is right now, in this moment, as scanning beams and chemical assays peel back the layers of stone and reveal the living animal beneath. Every year, new discoveries force us to redraw old pictures, and that is not a weakness of the science. It is its greatest strength. Pachycephalosaurus, the thick-headed lizard, has earned its name in a way its original discoverers never intended. It was thick-headed of us, stubborn and slow to change, to cling to a simple story when the evidence was trying to tell us something more complicated. But we are capable of learning. We can let the bones speak, even when they contradict our favorite tales. And when we do, we are rewarded with a vision of the past that is richer, stranger, and more beautiful than the one we had before. If you want to see more stories like this, stories that peel back the layers of what we think we know and reveal the unexpected truth beneath, then hit that subscribe button right now. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop a comment below telling me what other dinosaur myths you want me to investigate next. Share this with someone who grew up watching those old head-ramming documentaries and watch their jaw drop. Until next time, keep your mind open and your dome engorged with curiosity. I'll see you in the next one.